Super excited to be here and see some familiar names in the chat as well. Um, nice to see you guys. Looking forward to diving in here and giving you kind of that financial perspective, into the into this ramp up into the busy season. And to kick things off, we're just going to post a polling question as well. So. Really just trying to get an idea of what your plans are this year with hiring. So are you planning to add on field and overhead employees this year?
The results are coming in. I'll give just a few more seconds. All right, here we go.
Awesome. No, this is great. And we're going to touch on both, kind of thinking about the field employees, also, overhead as well. But it looks like, most of you are looking to add on some team members, right? Which is really going to be what this webinar is about, right? And trying to help everyone prepare there. So some of the things we're going to cover is labor efficiency, really ways to measure that, looking at some of the benchmarks and industry averages, capacity planning, which plays a big part in scaling the company, and then forecasting, right? So even looking at cash flow forecasting specifically and budgeting and kind of planning that out. And I know we have another polling question here before we dive into labor efficiency. So how does your landscaping company currently measure labor efficiency? And with a service-based company, labor is really going to be a big indicator to just the efficiency of the entire operation. So we'll see with a couple more seconds and see what your current process is for that right now.
Yep, just a few more moments here. We've still got some replies trickling in. And here we go.
All right, so we do have a few that are using some of the financial ratios, and but we do have quite a few as well that are not maybe focusing on this aspect. So it's definitely something to prioritize. And when you look into labor efficiency and certain financial metrics, and you can look at a lot of different expenses in this way as well, but look at your field labor percent as a percent of revenue, just as you would look at maybe your materials costs, right? So for install-based companies in 2023, these were the industry averages that we saw based on our internal data. So you can see for the install-based companies, it was 15% of total revenue for the field labor, right? So if your company's at 20%, then okay, maybe there's more efficiencies within the field that we can improve on. Also, you could see the overhead labor percent of revenue was 9.31%, right? So all of your management employees, administrative, sales made up the 9.3%. And you can really utilize those figures there. And going back to the field labor efficiency, basically there's another way to measure labor efficiency. Instead of comparing it to the top line sales, you can ultimately use it almost like a new revenue figure, right? Which is you're taking out all of your non-labor cost of goods sold. So or direct costs like materials, disposal costs, different expenses like that. That way, for instance, if you provide more, if you're doing two separate projects, one project is in your material is just a lot more expensive than another project where your material is less expensive, but it's going to take the same amount of time to install that. it shouldn't impact your labor efficiency, right? So it's just a more specific way into looking at that. And then also looking at overhead labor, right? So instead of comparing that to top line revenue, what you can also do is you can ultimately see what percent of that overhead labor is of your gross margin, right? So instead of measuring against top line revenue, you're measuring against your gross margin because that's really ultimately what you're going to have to basically pay the overhead staff, and that's ultimately how they're going to be held accountable and how efficient they can support the operation. So just a couple things to note, and you can kind of see just the difference between more of the maintenance and lawn care services versus the install-based services. And it's good to, look at these benchmarks, and ultimately you want to be typically a little bit better than what these are showing. So definitely something to consider because before you plan on adding on team members, you want to make sure that your current operation, even based on last year's data, is showing that your team's efficient, right? That business model is worth scaling. Also looking internally, right? Looking at, you know, are there any employees that can be cross-trained, right? And ultimately it's going to be easier, especially with some of the slow times where you have less employees, right? Because they're cross-trained instead of having more employees doing a lot of separate different items. It's a lot easier, um, and there's less bottlenecks to scaling up and scaling back down in slow season if you have less employees, right? So cross training is going to help you get there, and then also look at employee retention, right? Doing capacity planning or forecasting is great, but you want to make sure that your current business model and the way that your employees are being developed and retained in the company is at a good level first. Also, when it comes to optimizing labor, you can kind of look at it in two separate ways, right? So looking at it as a company and the services that the company performs, should they be performing that, or should they be subbing that work out? On the other side of it, looking at tasks that specific employees are working on, right? So if a management level employee is working on lower level tasks, then you're ultimately not optimizing labor as you should, and it's something that you should definitely be focusing on. And then looking at capacity planning, right? And capacity planning is a strategic process used by an organization to ensure that they have the appropriate resources, infrastructure, and capabilities to meet current and future demands efficiently and effectively. So it's basically making sure that your supply and demand is matching up as close as possible. And then also considering, okay, how are these different moves going to affect the customers and how are they going to affect the employees? And that's an important thing to consider with a lot of different business decisions, but especially capacity planning, because you can put yourself in a position where, you're understaffed, right? Because you want to, maybe reach higher profits that year, but what is the strain of that on the current team, right? And then thus, the strain on the team equals probably lower customer satisfaction and things being missed in the field. So it's important to understand how your different, planning components will affect both the customer and the employees. And then the seasonality it makes it difficult, right? Makes capacity planning difficult. Why? Because when you compare it to a business that doesn't have maybe those drastic rates of um, hiring needs and demand, um, you don't need to focus as much, and it's something that's spread across the year. Whereas this, you have less room for error, right? And you need to make sure and be realistic with uh, with matching those needs and those greater needs with the resources that are needed. We have a company. I think they were spending close to $500 a day on recruiting, trying to get some talent in the door. Why? Because they knew that they had to ramp up a lot for, and this company in particular did a lot of snow services. and another thing that you can also consider, because one thing, especially as the slow season um, progresses, you don't want to have your fixed costs at too high of a level. And a strategy you can take, and I know sometimes it could be difficult, right? Because you want to be able to retain some of the employees. A strategy you can take is, you know, use it more as an incentive where instead of paying them during the slow season as much as you are, decrease that amount and have a slight incentive when when the busy season starts, right? So they have an incentive to come back to work instead of maybe potentially going to find other work elsewhere. So 52% of employee turnover occurs within the first 12 months of employment. And why is that? It's, I think it can also be due to, I think a lot of companies need to refine just their recruiting and screening process, right? But this is important to understand because when you look at a scenario, right? So maybe company A versus company B. So company A, they have, let's say, four sales employees that have been there for over a year, right? Company B, they only have two sales employees that have been there, but this year they're hiring two, right? And they're going to be starting. Now, it's important to when you look at capacity in these two different scenarios, understand that there is more of a capacity cushion that's going to be needed for company B because there's a greater chance that there's going to be employee churn, right? That some employees may not work out. And in order for a company to sustain their operations, you need to make sure that you have the resources or maybe even additional personnel in companies B scenario rather than company A. So definitely something to consider. And also thinking about some of the delays when it comes to hiring. So and being realistic with how long is it going to take to actually fill these positions? So the metric is time to fill, right? So maybe for more of the frontline workers, it takes maybe 30 to 45 days. For the mid-level management, it could take 60 to 90. Maybe for some of the management executive level positions, it could take up to 6 months. And these are things that you should almost be monitoring within your company, right? And find ways to basically improve this. Utilize resources like Team Engine if you're not an already a Team Engine customer. Um, definitely like just as you would measure KPIs in the financial world, or maybe you measure KPIs in the field. These are things that you want to look at. You want to treat recruiting as a department, even if you don't have someone that is your recruiter, and maybe it's just part of someone's task. Make sure that you're building out the operations where you have the processes and the checklists, and you understand some of these KPIs. And then you also want to make sure that you plan to have a lag or delay in efficiencies when you hire a new team member. It's going to take time even after that delay of hiring them, right? It's going to take time for them to ultimately produce at basically the top efficiency. And these are things that you need to understand when you're building up your team, when you're thinking about the capacity. And then making sure that you're utilizing your team's input when you're doing capacity planning and keeping in close contact. Build it as part of your discussion when you're doing the employee evaluations, or at Cycle CPA we call quarterly huddles. uh, I know even today when we did a team meeting, we had breakout sessions where everyone could basically, where we had a specific topic, and they broke out into groups, and they discussed it, and we came back together, and we discussed what are some of the things that can be improved on, or what are some ideas, right? So making sure that your team is part of this conversation, and making sure that you're utilizing software and technology and you're instead of sometimes looking at, okay, maybe we need to utilize staff to fill this specific need. Maybe it's more of something that you just have to add software or piece of equipment, and making sure that you're ultimately holding yourself accountable to like for instance, a company that's 300,000 revenue is not going to be able to afford the same overhead as a company that's 1.2 million revenue, right? And you want to hold yourself accountable to that, because ultimately that's what's going to allow you to basically hire, right? So and we're going to get more into kind of how to build out that um, sales projection, but you want to make sure that it's not being guided as much from the perspective of how busy the person is, more based off of the reality of, okay, how much should they be managing?
Thank you, Joe. And I'll get into forecasting. Danielle, I know you have a polling question. All right, so which method do you primarily rely on for forecasting staffing needs during the spring rush? And I'm going to apologize in advance if you hear my dog while I'm presenting.
We're just waiting on a few more replies to come in, and I will show those results. And we all have pets at home, Carla.
Yeah, you're good. You're good, but mailman comes and it's a yeah.
He's got one job and he's doing it.
Exactly.
Here come those poll results.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so it looks like mostly going with like informal decision with team members. So kind of talking about it amongst the team and coming up with that decision together. And of course, as an accountant, I want you guys to vote more on the analyzing historical data and market trends, but we'll get more into that. And then some of you are currently not engaged in forecasting, so this will be good for you guys to kind of be able to see how you can get started with those items. All right, awesome. So first off, before you even start forecasting, we want to make sure that you have accurate accounting, because how can we forecast in the future if we don't have accurate historical information in there? So in your QuickBooks or whatever accounting software you're using, making sure that you are reconciling, bookkeeping is done accurately, and everything balances out at the end of each month. Separating your financials by departments, divisions, locations can also be helpful too. The more information that you have, the better with forecasting. Also taking a look at non-financial KPIs as well will be helpful. And like I said, the more accurate that you know that your financials are, the better that we can get with the forecasting and the accuracy of that. So with cash flow, again, it's like, I think the statistic is like 80% of businesses fail because of cash flow needs. So accurate, having adequate cash flow throughout the year to be able to stay on the offensive side. It's difficult to kind of capitalize on opportunities without cash. So if you're looking to grow the business, if you want to hire that manager, add on equipment, all of these things are going to be difficult without the cash flow needed upfront first. And just be careful what you cut during poor cash flow times. So for example, if you're going to cut marketing, that's not going to drive sales. So, it's important to see and prioritize what you cut during those times. And this is a graph, the cash on hand. So what you'll need in your bank account is what we recommend is 2 times operating or fixed costs. So as you can see here in this graph, at the end of December, this client, what we're saying is that they need about 621 thousand in their bank account at the end of that period to sustain operations, and not so that way we don't have a dip in cash flow like they did in January 2023 or February, if you can see there. So you kind of want to follow that line and determine what is 2 times operating expenses and making sure you have that cushion in your bank account. And then net cash flow is different than like net profit. So a lot of us know net profit, right? So you know your net profit goal is like 10% or 15%, but that's different than your net cash flow percentage, because your net cash flow is what's in your bank account or how much that increases by. So let's say at the beginning of this year, you have 10,000 in your bank account, and at the end of this year, you want to increase that by, to 50,000. That is your net cash flow percentage increase, right? And that's what I'm wanting to see. I want to see what your net cash flow percentage is. And for this business, their target is 7%, and you can kind of see the trends here and when that dips below here. And then, Joe, are you going over this one?
Yeah, so for when you're looking at the building a projection, right? You're going to consider, similar to what Carla had just covered in the previous slide, looking at some of the historical information. Where was your cash flow before, right? Where were some of those months where you hit low cash flow points, and use that historical information, right? And which is huge, right? When you're considering to build out a budget and a forecast. But that's not the only thing to look at, right? Are there certain market factors? Are you seeing, and this could vary based on a specific state, even specific regions within the state can be very different, right? Um, Looking at your current growth rate. So this is also part of this is also can be built into the assumptions and goals, right? Because yeah, your numbers could be a certain way last year, but at the same time, you may be looking to really ramp up your growth rate and really increase sales this year. So those are things that you want to build in. Also, one of the most accurate ways to build a forecast is to consider some of the actual contracts or projects that are already in the pipeline, right? So if you're if you didn't hit your sales goals last year, but this year you're booked out far in the future, and your confidence in that is higher, that you're going to be able to keep that up, then you have really good information that you can utilize when you're building out that forecast to make it as accurate as possible. And then, as Carla touched on as well, looking at some of the non-financial KPIs, and it's nice to get granular and looks at specific financial KPIs or key performance indicators, basically what metrics are important to focus on, right? When you look at the non-financial side, these things are going to give you that backup information that is going to make some of those forecasts as accurate as possible. So total leads, close ratio, customer satisfaction. Because, for instance, if the customer satisfaction was low, then that could be an indicator that basically your customers may churn at a little bit higher of a rate. So these are all things that can play into when you're building out your sales budget.
Joe, can I interrupt real quick? We had a
Sure.
question come in just now while you were discussing that, asking how can you track, like what kind of KPI can be used to track customer satisfaction?
Yeah, so you can send out surveys to your customers. You can build it into your process to also, have specific reminders for yourself to have touch points with your customers, even if it's through conversations, you know, having that as a process, right? Just as you would have a process for performing the work in the field, you can build that in as well, right? And um, I know Danielle, I know software companies use is it the NPI score or different metrics?
Yeah, net promoter score.
Yeah,
Yeah, we've
yeah. So,
yeah.
and some of you may have seen that, right, with some softwares that you use. But for instance, that's how certain softwares are measured, right? Or that's kind of like how they can look at it and measure how happy their customers are with the platform. So look at your company and the services that you provide in a similar way as well.
Thank you.
So, and then also trying your best to turn some of this financial data into measurable measurable things that the company can hit so that you can basically relay that information and say, okay, yeah, this certain amount or 500,000 that we want to add, this actually equates to this amount of jobs that are going to be needed. And then also making sure that you're tying any of that growth and progress not only to revenue but also to your net profit and net cash flow as well, because that's going to allow you to continue to invest back into the company. And then trying to really track your break even point as well, and understand as well, okay, what is going to be needed to just hit that metric, which is something we calculate for our clients as well. And if you're unsure about how to do that, we have a budgeting video on our YouTube channel, Cycle CPA, where it runs through the calculations for the break even, which we won't go too much into today.
Oh, yeah, so this is the sales and production budget. Basically, this is just something that you can create on Excel worksheet, and you can break it out by division. So if you have different divisions, you can break it out that way. So for this company, we're looking at their design build division. You can see what their sales goal is for April. And of course, you always want to measure that against your actuals to keep, track of your goals, and also keep track of those sales employees and what they're responsible for and keeping them accountable to that as well. But with that, we also track revenue per employee per hour. So that is your sales divided by the amount of direct field labor hours. And then that just gives you an average. So you can have that as well. And you can pull your payroll reports each month to get your actuals for that, to calculate what that would be. And of course, this company knocked it out of the park. They're at 111 per hour. Their goal was to be an average of $100 an hour. And that also measures efficiency too, because if for whatever reason your payroll hours are way more than you had budgeted, then you may look at different jobs that cause your estimates, to go overboard with the budgeted hours. Or maybe you're having staffing issues where you're having like overtime or whatever. So those are very important metrics to track as well. And this is an example of like a cash flow statement, which maybe many of you have seen. And basically what we have is money that's coming into the account and money that's coming out of the account. So you can see the different balance sheet and profit and loss items on there as well. And Joe, do you want to go over this one?
Sure. So this is basically what a forecast looks like. And a nice thing about this is a traditional budget may not take into account your some of your balance sheet items. like some of your loan payments, which you can see towards the lower part of the Excel sheet. But ultimately, this is a projected look at to all of the cash coming in and leaving the company, right? Over a certain time span. So again, utilizing a lot of those different components that I had mentioned before, whether it's the historical information, scenario planning, you're going to add something in, seeing what that effect is. And with the seasonal business model, this becomes even more crucial because there are some of those dips in cash, especially during the slow times. So and you could create this in Excel. There's some platforms out there as well where you can utilize. We like the platform called Fathom, but there's others as well. But definitely something to consider.
Yeah, sorry, just wanted to look at the closing balance. So that would be your projected closing balance in your checking account. So what you want to have at the end of each month. And then the beginning balance is the beginning balance in your bank statement. And that's what I was talking to you guys about. The net cash flow, you're gonna start off at like 25,000 in January, but in June, this company's projected to end at 58,000 in their bank account. Again, at the end of each month, you want to measure budgeted versus actuals to see what kind of cash outflows you can improve on, or what items were met or were not met during the month as well.
And companies that are growing at a faster rate, there's a difference between those kind of companies and then companies that are not growing at as fast of a rate. The industry average was around 15% for companies' growth within 2023. So if you're under that, then but if you're over, then that means that you probably may have needed to invest more into some of the training and development of employees, recruiting and onboarding. You probably purchased more fixed assets. You may have invested more into marketing. You may incurred a little bit more debt, right? So these are all things, again, as you're forecasting out and budgeting out for the future, these are things you need to take into account if you are looking to grow. And this is even looking at the rate of growth as well. So a company going from 1 million to 2 million, right? That's an increase in 1 million, right? Whereas last year, maybe they went from 500,000 to $1 million. That's 500,000 increase, right? This year they're looking to increase by 1 million, right? So that's doubling your growth rate. So are the rest of your operations going to be able to support that increase? And I think that's important to understand as well. And part of that piece is is making sure you have the team members in place, but it's also things like recruiting as well. And why again something like Team Engine comes in handy because you're able to support that growth and have the resources for it. So just as we saw, kind of the difference between company A and company B, where company B is the company where they don't have all the salespeople in place and they have to add them on this year. This is an example where, yes, you might almost have a similar budget for that year between these two companies, but company B, there's a lot more uncertainty with the top line sales, right? So maybe both these companies had a goal of 2 million in revenue. I would say company B, there's a lot more of a risk that they may not necessarily hit that. So it's something to consider, especially when you consider not only just the possibility of churn within that first year with the employee, and it may just not work out for many specific for any reasons, but also the fact that it also takes that lag, right, of that salesperson being able to get up to efficiencies, and then also being able to, uh, you know, eventually once they hit their point of efficiency, being able to kind of stay on target. So uh, again, it's kind of just another reason to, there's specific things that you want to look into, and sometimes you have to look a little bit deeper and really have an understanding before you set these high sales targets and and these goals. And it's good, and it's nice to be um, optimistic with your sales targets, but one of the issues that can happen is that you think that, okay, I'm going to hit this specific sales number, and you may have then over budgeted the amount of fixed costs that you're going to have to incur. And you don't want to put yourself in that position, because then what may end up happening, especially in this circumstance, maybe one or two of the salespeople don't work out in company B, then you're almost stuck with, kind of these extra fixed costs that you thought you could have, afforded based on your initial, aggressive sales number. So, um, definitely
That's what
something
happened.
to consider.
That's what happened a lot last year in 2023. People had very high like sales goals in their budget for 2023 just based off of like 2022 and how that went. And so we were finding like in the middle of the year we had to like redo the whole budget because now they're in like a totally different position. Of course, it didn't happen to everybody, but the sales weren't there and were kind of dropping off and weren't as aggressive as they were in 2022. And so therefore we had to cut some overhead costs and stuff like that. So that's just a perfect example of that.
And then when you're looking at different things like capacity planning, forecasting, different things like that, and scaling, you want to, and it almost goes back to also the perspective of making sure that you're breaking out divisions, especially as your company grows, and getting accurate accounting data, because you want to be able to, almost like you were starting off your company, and you evaluate each decision based on, okay, what was the profitability of that decision, or what was the ROI on that, right? And as your company grows, sometimes it could get easier to become more complacent and think that, oh well, I may not have to be as profitable in this division, or I may not have to increase efficiencies in this because my other operation's doing really well, or whatever it is. So I think it's important to, as you're building out that forecast and managing cash flow, is to be intentional and proactive in making sure that you don't become complacent with with some of these moves. So that pretty much wraps up most of the items here. And I know we had some questions that kind of trickled through, and but
Yeah.
yeah, definitely feel free to, enter some more questions, and be happy to answer them.
Yeah, we do have a few questions from the chat to cover, but yes, please keep them coming. To continue on the forecasting conversation, someone asked, how far out for forecasting is too far?
I usually recommend at least 6 months of forecasting to a year. But then past that, it's like, you don't know what's gonna happen, especially in a business, in a small business like that. So I say at least 6 months, if not a year.
Yeah, there'd be too much uncertainty in a forecast much further out, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Going back to something that was discussed earlier in the presentation, that whole idea of, the company A who had 4 existing sales employees versus company B who had 2, and then we're bringing on 2. Part of the reason that that's less than ideal is because there's some ramp up time there as well, right? And John V had asked if you have any metrics on how long it takes for new hires to start to provide ROI. In that example, you were talking about sales folks. John is asking with particular interest in garden installation and maintenance companies.
Field hires, gotcha.
Yeah.
So, and it's for install or maintenance companies. I would say install-based services typically require a little bit more technical skills. So that could just, I guess, when you look at that in comparison to some of the maintenance services, it could be a little bit higher typically. Uh, as for specific months or a specific metric, um, we don't have something that's like hard data on that, unfortunately. But I would say one of the things with that is definitely trying to put yourself in the position where you can build up your training process and development process where you can not only get them ramped up to full efficiency as fast as possible without utilizing too much of maybe management or basically taking away other people's capacity. And ways you could do that is training videos, checklists, uh, different things like that, right? Really implementing that hard. And one of the benefits of that will be that you can then also put yourself in a position where if that person is not a good fit, then sooner rather than later. Because the worst thing you can do is have someone on for 5 months instead of 2 months, right? And just think about that those 3 months and that difference and the amount of not only inefficiencies but the amount of energy and time that it took away from some of the management team members as well when they've tried to train this person when in reality it wasn't a good fit, right? So I think trying to get to that point as quick as possible
Yeah.
is something to definitely focus on.
Although we don't have the hard data on how long it takes to train up somebody, we did do a poll in our group one time that I remember. And the range was 1 to 6 months, but I think the sweet spot was like most people were coming in at like 3 months.
Yeah, I imagine there's no specific
Yeah.
answer. It varies depending on a lot of different factors. But yeah, that's a good question that we might take to our team engine community and see if we
Definitely.
can get some conversations going around that.
Definitely.
I've got a couple more questions here. There was a mention early on about incentives to get those employees to stay with you and stick around and or come back for the next season. Also incentivizing them to work on efficiency. Do you have any specific examples of those types of incentives?
Yeah, so there's some companies make it very granular based on that, and they may base it specifically off of the specific projects that they're working on, based off of like almost similar to how we were looking at before with the percent of revenue that is paid out to the field labor, right? So ultimately, almost basing it off of that, right? And that metric. Um, you can also look at, um, instead of looking at like per project or per day, look at per like per quarter and trying to and maybe it's gross margin, right? Especially if it's more management level team members. I would definitely recommend trying your best to tie incentives to some of basically you want to tie to metrics that closely relate to what their role is within the company. Because for for instance, the field labor employees, they may, yes, they have a big impact on gross margin, but they may not have as much of an impact on net profit because there's a lot more things that kind of go into play, right? A company may decide to spend a lot more in marketing, thus lowering your net profit, for that given period, but that field labor employee, they still work very efficiently. So that's why it's important to try your best to kind of tie it, as much as possible. And then even going back to, I think just the timing of it, where you could potentially build in some of those bonuses and some of those incentives as closely as possible to when your demand is the highest, right? And when these employees are in most need, or when you need those employees most, right? Which is ultimately going to lower your risk as a company, right? Making sure that you have these team members available when you need them. So
Awesome. Yeah, great stuff. The chat has quieted down. I don't see too many more questions coming in. So I think we can start to wrap things up here. Thanks to all of our attendees for sticking with us for the full time. This was recorded, and I will be sending out an email later today with the link to that recording, as well as some additional resources. So be sure to look out for that email. I'll plug the Team Engine community one more time, which I mentioned at the beginning of the call. So if you are a Team Engine customer and you're interested in joining our community space, it's in beta launch right now, open only to our green industry customers. And we're having conversations over there around, how long it should take to ramp up new hires and other things like that. So if you're interested in joining, just reply to that email later today. Let me know and I'll get you all taken care of. But yeah, thanks to everyone for attending. And Joe and Carla, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of wisdom and knowledge with us. I think this will be really helpful heading into the busy season. So thanks so much. And I think we'll see you all next time.
Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Danielle.
Bye.
All right.